Apparently, the current government is preparing well for a true two front war, but is it prepared enough for another half front war with the internal enemies? I'm asking this question because when anti national protests go on, our government does nothing to end the protests. If it is not doing enough, then what steps should the government take to control them? Okay, so I understand what you're talking about. You're talking about the what was it called, Shaheen Bagh, that episode which went on for a few months, and also the so-called farmer protests, right? And these all these episodes, protests, whatever you call them, happened in the national capital, New Delhi. They went on for several months, and the government did not break up the protests. It allowed these protests to continue. Why is it so? Is the Indian government useless? Is it powerless? Or is there something else to the story that we don't see? You may remember a couple of years ago, I don't remember how long it was, maybe 2 years ago or so, there was this sudden, apparently spontaneous outpouring of protests in Thailand. Students, you know, educated students, well educated students, college and university students, affluent students wearing, expensive clothing, coming out with placards and all that, and they took Bangkok essentially hostage. It happened out of nowhere. These so-called supposedly spontaneous protests. It went on for a while, and then all overnight the protests evaporated. How did that happen? It went on for quite some time, just like what happened in Shaheen Bagh and the farmer protests and riots and all that. Do you know how much logistics it takes, how much planning it takes, how much money it takes to organize and sustain protests? You need to keep people motivated. You need to ensure that people are there in place. You need to ensure that food is delivered to them, all the facilities are delivered to them. You need to ensure these people get paid, I suppose, and so on and so forth. It takes a lot of logistics and planning and resources, lots of money to do that. Where does all this come from? I wonder, right? So, when these protests happened in India, the Shaheen Bagh thing or the farmer thing or whatever, the question is, who was behind it? Who was funding it? Who was organizing it? Who was planning it? Who switches it on and who switches it off? And why did the government not intervene in this? Because, see, the thing is this: there are certain powerful forces in the world that can create protests and what's called color revolutions at a moment's notice. They have things in place in various countries, assets in place, people in place, logistics in place. They have sources of funding via NGOs and all that, and they can create an eruption of protesting and violence and all that. See what happened in Ukraine in 2014. Two new TV stations come up overnight and start broadcasting certain kinds of messagery, and thousands of people are there in the Euromaidan Square. Who's organizing it all? Who's funding it all? And what happened in Thailand? Was it some kind of message to the Thai government? And what about the other, so all the other various color revolutions that happen? Who does this? This is a process that is iteratively perfected. The process of creating a color revolution. So, when a very powerful foreign power does such things, it is best to just let it simmer down on its own, right? Because if the government had used force to disperse these protests, then just imagine what the international media was waiting for. They were waiting for creating a Tiananmen Square kind of story in India. That's what they were waiting for. And the Indian government did not give them the opportunity. It tolerated this nonsense. It happened with the Shaheen Bagh thing, it happened with the so called farmer protests. So, this is foreign interference in India. India is not so powerful that it can resist certain countries. So, right now, what we have to do is keep our head down, bide our time, and work really, really hard for the next 2, 3 decades and build up our economy and our power. That's when we will be able to stand up to these very powerful foreign outside forces, because they don't want India to succeed. They don't want India to rise. So right now The government is doing what is needed. If you look at the history of China, for the longest time, they swallowed all the insults, they swallowed everything that was thrown at them. They were meek, they were submissive, and they just kept on working. So that's what India needs to do. Yes, we have enemies. We have enemies outside, we have enemies inside. And the enemies inside are actually an extension of the enemies outside. So these external enemies are cultivating assets within our country, and they are funding them via NGOs and whatnot. This is how it works. This is what they do worldwide. And as long as you are a small power, as long as you are not a major global power, you're gonna have to find other ways of dealing with this. You know, so that's what India is doing right now. I would disagree that the Indian government, the current government, is not doing enough to safeguard India's national security. What it has done, what it is doing, is the best course of action. The Prime Minister even took back the farm laws because of what was going on. In You have to look at the long term perspective, the long term national interest. Yes, you may have to do some chess sacrifices in the short term so that you win the chess game in the long term. That's how it goes. So I think India is doing well in that regard.